modern Christians are too tolerant, too nice, too anxious to be popular, and too quick to make excuses for sin in its many forms. God's people should be willing to stand for God. And isn't that the truth? You see me go about modern day Christianity nowadays, all the false teachings, the lukewarmness, the watering everything down, the dry as a desert churches that we have. Modern day Christians, not all, but there's some, quite a few actually, that are too tolerant, put up with anything, put up with the false teachings, don't do anything about it, don't want to teach people properly, don't open a Bible and tell them, well, this is what the Bible says on the subject, nobody wants to do that anymore. We don't open a Bible. And in fact, it's sad and it may shock some people, but, the Bible is hardly even read in some churches. Some pastors don't even preach from it. They preach their own sermon that they didn't get from the Bible. I'm not saying God doesn't put things on your heart and your mind to preach, to talk about, anything like that. I'm not saying that. But what they talk about, it's not from the Bible. It's a candy-coated, sugar-coated sermon that doesn't get anybody anywhere, that just provides temporary comfort, but in the long run can lead somebody on a path to potential destruction. Too nice. Now, this does not mean we should not be loving, we should not be kind to each other, This doesn't mean we should be mean and nasty to people. That's not Christ-like behavior. But what people seem to forget, and what I see many people don't realize, is that people think that being kind, loving, and everything else, and shining and showing the love of Christ, means that, they sugarcoat everything. They tell people what they want to hear all the time. Sometimes hard truth, there's also that in love. If you truly love somebody, you'll tell them the hard truth. You won't let them walk on a path that could lead to potential destruction. And I think people forget that. Love is not always just mushy-gushy. That's what I think. Yes, it can be that, definitely. But there is tough love, too. And I think people have forgotten that aspect because they don't want to hear about it and they don't like feeling it. But I'm going to tell you something, when people think that it's always mushy-gushy 24/7, you see how that's going. Nobody wants to hear truth. You tell anybody an ounce of truth, they're offended, they get mad, they hate you, By the way, you see that in the Bible with Jesus, he infuriated many of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, because he spoke an ounce of truth. He called out their hypocrisy, so nothing's really changed over the years. And, they operated under a spirit of religion. We see plenty operating under that now, too. Hypocrisy, arrogance, all of it. Too anxious to be popular, too anxious to have everybody love you. I'm not saying you should sit and try to make enemies on purpose, If you're truly a Christian, truly speaking truth, truly living for God, you're kind of just going to make enemies on your own. I'm not saying be mean to people, I'm not saying any of that, please don't misinterpret this. Some people take that a step further and say this means being mean to people and everything else. No, that doesn't, but, Jesus said, if the world hates you, remember that it hated him first, and that's why to us true Christians, the world hates us because they hated him first. Of course they're going to hate on us, It's funny how many people that call themselves Christians hate on us too when we speak reality. That we don't fall for the candy-coated nonsense that people tell them. And maybe that's not always their fault either that they live to that teaching. Somebody else along the way likely taught it to them. And, that's where you just got to pray that, the Lord would reveal the truth to them. Too anxious to be popular, to fit in with everything. I see plenty of churches that are doing that, to be popular. The church nowadays, and it's sad, It's run like a business nowadays. It's, oh, come to our church. We're better than that one down the road. We're better than these people that shame you. I shouldn't say shame. That's of the enemy. That show you tough love and speak reality, that make you want to not live in sin. Come to our church. We sugarcoat, we candy coat, we tell you what you want to hear. You're good to go. You do whatever the heck you please. And you see how that's going? That's why we have a society and a world that's crumbling. People say, well, why doesn't God fix the problems, the corruption in the White House? Well, have you seen the mess that's in God's house? That's why there's the mess in the White House. Because see, here's the thing. If God's house would get fixed and didn't have all the corruption, if it would get cleaned up, the White House would get cleaned up. This nation was founded with God, Our founding fathers acknowledged, knew that God blessed us with this nation, gave us this nation. It's a shame that so many, have forsaken that, and people wonder why our government's the way it is. And people say, well, it didn't happen that way overnight. No, it didn't. It happened from years of it being allowed to happen. Everything you see, the corruption going on in the government, has gone on for many years. Before I was born, before you were born, before our parents were all born, even before our grandparents were born. This corruption that you see in both God's house and the White House is nothing new. The problem is it's been brushed under the rug for how many years, or it's been behind the scenes. And now the problem is, it's now out in the open. And it's just interesting now when it's out in the open, how many people are still blind to the reality of things. I think some of that is they're willingly, they don't want to see the reality. They like to just wear the blinders and stay blind to it. And they're going to find out in the long run that doesn't get you anywhere. And, that's what people just don't realize, The corruption that's going on in this world is because there's corruption in God's house. In the White House here in America, but I know there's people in other countries on my page that like my post. And you know what? The same goes in your country. 10-1, there is corruption in God's house in your country too, which is why your government is corrupt too. And you know what? Because people don't sit and preach the reality, preach the truth, stand for reality. You know what? Everybody's just allowed it to happen around the world. Especially here in America, though. It's just been allowed to happen, So we just remember that. If God's house, fix God's house, the government system will get fixed. Here in America, in the White House, and in your country as well. And too quick to make excuses for sin in its many forms. I'm not saying I'm a perfect being that never stumbles, but I'm going to tell you something. Have you ever noticed modern day Christianity doesn't talk about sin, doesn't preach anything, talk about anything that makes people want to better themselves, that has people living in sin and rebelling? Have you ever noticed that in the modern day church? That's problematic, because you know what? God has said that so many times here in the Bible. God hates sin. He doesn't hate people. He hates the sin. And we've allowed that sin, People just sit on their rear ends and allow it to take over. And you know what? It's trickled its way into our society and everything else. None of us are perfect. But here's the thing. We can acknowledge that and then better ourselves. That's the problem nowadays. Nobody wants to better themselves. They think, oh, they're fine living in sin and rebellion. And that's probably because they go to a church that tells them that. And they probably haven't opened a Bible 5 minutes because they would probably see otherwise. That, or if they have a church that they go to, they twist around the Bible. But nonetheless, God's people should be willing to stand for God. We should all stand for God. Y'all have a great and blessed day. I love yous.